Hi, welcome. We're doing sequins today. Sequins are fun to do. I love sequins. I know I say that about like every fabric, but I really do. I love every fabric except fleece. Don't even put me near that stuff. It makes me want to throw up. It's way too soft to be natural. Like it's so I can't even touch it. But thankfully, I will not be rendering that today. We are going to do the sequins that you see right here in front of you, as well as a different type of sequins. It's kind of like the rows of sequins. Do you remember did any of you guys have like Hannah Montana like scarves or something like that, and it was just like rows of sequins? That's what I'm going to show you guys next. But first, we're going to get started with this little teal number over here. I did a little practice round on the left, and the right will end up looking the same, but it'll just kind of give you an idea of what we're doing as we go along and kind of understand what that final product is going to look like. Per usual, we are going to pick a light source first. This is important because with sequins, not only are you rendering shadows, you're also creating highlights through those sequins. And so you want to have an idea of where these highlights are going to be placed, and like we have gone over a couple times, those highlights are going to be the parts of the body closest to the light source, and then your shadows are going to be opposite or areas hidden under ruffles or wrinkles or just intentional construction folds. Then from here, we're just going to go in, we're actually just going to shade the whole dress all in one base layer like we did with the garments. I'm going to cut that out because it's kind of a long process for me to shade this in for some reason, and you guys already know how to do it, so I want to keep this content to new information only, so I will be right back. Look at that, you guys didn't even know I was gone. So what I'm doing now in super speed mode, because the shading took so long, I am just going in and I'm starting to add shadows with that same color that I used to fill in the dress. When doing sequins, I noticed that I actually don't really worry about having like blended shadows as much as I normally would. I don't really worry about it normally, but it's really okay to have that kind of stark line between these, because when you are adding these sequins, you'll see that adding these lighter and darker dots around our shadows are going to create a blended effect, so you don't really need to worry about how these shadows look exactly. They don't need to be perfect. But I do make sure to add in shadows in all the places that I normally would add them, especially around like the stomach or where it gathers, around the calf, any ruffle shadows, and then I will go in with a darker marker and I will hit those darkest points in my shadows. And so this is to just really create a lot of depth. You're going to use some really dramatic differences in value with your sequins. So I highly recommend using probably 2 or maybe even 3 different values for your shadows and your markers. So if you have a couple different markers with the same color but different values, I would suggest using that for your practice. If not, you can just layer up the same marker a few times. Just be a little bit weary about putting too much on and kind of getting stuck and maybe messing around with your paper. But other than that, that's all we're doing for the shading part to start out. And then, if you notice that there's any shadows that you want to go back and fill back in, you can totally do that. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm looking back at that first photo and fixing any other shadows that I forgot to add. After you get your garment all like shaded and colored in, what I like to do is I like to kind of just figure out where these highlights are going to be. You can like block them out with a little pencil if you want. You don't have to. But if you kind of forget, have a tendency to forget where you want your highlights to be, this is a good time to add them in, to add in these little blocks. So these highlight areas is where you're going to concentrate your sequins, your lightest sequins, I should say. For this fabric, you are going to use like either a white gel pen or a white marker. You could use gouache, which is like an opaque watercolor, or acrylic. You just need something that's opaque and white or like a really light value for this. So I'm using my white gel pen. What is she? She's a Jelly Roll 08 for that. But before we add in those sequins in the highlight areas, we need to add our darker sequins in the rest of the garment. So for this, okay, I'm going to say this the best that I can. We are going to use a color that is one value darker than the color we are working in. Does that make sense? So I'm working in the shadow, that first set of shadows that we created with the same color marker as the dress. So I'm going to use one value darker, which is that dark teal that I used in the darkest spots, to create little dots, just random little dots. I use the tapered tip because I just noticed that kind of creates a little bit less uniformity. It's a little bit more natural looking than the chisel tip, and it's kind of weird to get a good dot out of the chisel tip. So I use the tapered end, and I just kind of go around and I concentrate those darkest dots in the darkest part of those shadows, and then I kind of disperse them outwards towards those highlights, but not really going into those highlight boxes. So you're going to do this throughout the whole sequin part of your garment. So I'm only doing this in the torso and skirt portion of it. I'm not going to do it in the cups or that sarong on the side. But when you are doing this, it's okay to kind of be random with it. We are only using this teal marker and a black marker and the white for the sequins. So, just fill in as much as you want with this teal marker or whatever marker you're using, I guess. And you can always go back and add more. I have noticed that I like to kind of concentrate these darker sequins in the areas where there is change in value. So like when we added those shadows, and I said, don't really worry about the line. That's kind of the area, that line between darker shadows and like the mid-tone or the lighter shadow. That's what I'm talking about, adding a lot of sequins into. This just kind of helps blend it. So when you add a lot of sequins on either side of that line and you kind of disperse it and change the quantity and concentration as you move towards those highlights, that'll really help create that blended look. If anybody has ever stippled in their life, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then, once you feel comfortable with the amount of sequins that you've added, you can always go in and add more. It's not a done deal once you whip out the white pen, but once you feel comfortable with that, you can go in and add just a couple. I don't have anything darker than the dark teal, so I just add a couple black sequins sparingly to the shadows that are darkest. Your white gel pen is all that's left. So all you're doing is it's the exact same thing as the other dots. You are just putting a ton of little white dots in those highlight areas that maybe you blocked out, maybe you didn't, but any highlight that you could expect from a garment, you want to place just a large concentration of white dots there, and then you can kind of disperse them outwards to blend in with those mid-tones and those darker dots. Sometimes I've noticed also that the white gel pen can be a little bit finicky with the sequins, but I do think that they have the best results. So I kind of sometimes you might have to use like a little tissue or something and kind of wipe off the end. There might be a little bit of buildup of ink, but I think it's worth it. The struggle is worth it, guys, and you're just going to keep adding this and building it up until you kind of can see that nice gradation of value and you feel like there is some kind of highlight that you can identify within your garment. You can stop here or you can add sparkle crosses. There's a couple different ways to do them. You can do them with like a little circle and then go up, down, left, right, or you can just do an X, or you can do a circle and then kind of like use your finger to smear it in each direction. That does not give me the control I need in my life. So I usually do the circle with, let me try to get an example for you, a circle with up, down, left, right. And then you can kind of throw those in anywhere you want. I would start out small. Sometimes I get a little bit like crazy with it, you know? I get really excited and amped up to do my sparkle crosses. And then I add too many and now, you know, you regret it later. So I like to start out sparingly and then kind of take a look back at the whole thing and then see if I need to add any more. We are going to concentrate sparkle crosses just outside of your highlights. This is because when you put your sparkle crosses right in the middle of those super bright highlights where there's a lot of white, it's harder to see. So I like to take them and put them just outside of my highlight area, and that way it'll kind of accentuate this highlight, but also it will give contrast so that you can see the whole sparkle cross. So that is your basic sequin demo. I'm also going to go ahead and just show you a second one that would also be applicable to sequins and to sparkly fabric. So let's get into that one. Now we're going to get started with the second sequin demo. This one is the one that reminds me of Hannah Montana. It's a very 2000s vibe. It is meant to replicate the fabrics that have rows of sequins rather than the kind of randomized sequins pattern you might be used to seeing. And so for this, I already shaded the dress, the base layers. I just used two colors. I used a red for the base layer, and then I went over that again and made some distinct shadow marks with that same red, and then I went in with a darker red and just hit those darkest shadows. For this, you are going to need, I used gouache. I thought that this worked best, especially because there are some dots that I liked to pick up and just kind of do really lightly. And with gouache, you can kind of have some control over the opacity of your white paint. So that is what I'm using. But you can also use the white pen and then just kind of pick it up with your thumb or with your finger or tissue or something like that. And let's actually just get into it. So you're going to start by adding your gouache in those highlight areas in horizontal rows. And you can kind of make these little circles as big or as small as you want. Just try to keep them uniform. Your brightest dots are going to be on your brightest highlights. And then as we kind of move outward from those highlight areas, we are going to mix a little bit more water in with the gouache, or you can kind of pick it up with a tissue if that is works better for you. But it's kind of random how you order it. I like to just kind of make like a general shape of a highlight and then go out from there. It's not a, it's not a science which spots exactly need dots and how many rows exactly to make. It's really up to you. So it's really up to you in how many rows or columns you want to do of these sequins. Just making sure that you are applying them in rows and columns that are pretty evenly spaced and uniform with one another. And then as you kind of go outwards, like I said earlier, you can add more water to your gouache so it's a little more opaque. It looks a little bit more like that red. And you're just going to keep doing that. You don't need to fill up the whole dress with these dots. It's just really, you want to create enough dots to suggest that the whole dress is made of sequins, but you don't really need to take the time to put in every single dot. You just want it to read as though the whole dress is in dots. And that really is accomplished mainly by those white dots, because those are the ones that the eyes see first. And when you have it in multiple places with multiple highlights, you can really kind of get an understanding for that reading as the entire dress. From here, I'm going to take the red and I'm just going to hit some of those areas around the white dots with those red dots. And this is just going to kind of follow those same lines, not, fully covering the whole dress like I said earlier. And you're really just actually going to do that with the other colors as well. It's like the other sequin demo that we just did. You're going to work with a color that's a value darker than the dress itself. So for that red, I used the same red, but since it's a second layer, it's darker, and then for that mid-tone or that second layer of red that I'm working in right now, I use the color that was in the shadows, the darker shadows. And for those darker shadows, I didn't have any darker reds, so I used, I think it's like a wine kind of burgundy color, and then I hit those last sequins with that. But as long as you are using those white sequins in the right spots to create those really bright highlights, you should be able to read it as a whole dress of sequins. It's a kind of a different technique, so it might be a little bit awkward at first. It definitely took me a couple tries to kind of get the hang of it, but I think it's a really cool technique worth mentioning. And I just learned it, so we're both picking up this one at the same time. And then, of course, you know me, sparkle crosses. You gotta add them. I just think these look so good with this technique. And then you can just toss them in. This one you can put the sparkle crosses in the brightest highlights because there is more contrast in those areas. But you can also put them outside of it. I did that too. And it does work with gouache or gel pen. I usually use gel pen because I have more control and it's smaller. But that's all I have for you guys. So go off, have fun. I'm so excited to see your croquis.